training and metabolic conditioning. This is Kyle Valor from HydroWorks, and I'll be the moderator for this session today. Thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to bring you this educational content today. This webinar is being recorded, and a recording link will be emailed to all attendees afterward. At the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. Please type your questions into the chat bar in the webinar dashboard on the right side of your screen at any time during the presentation, and I'll read them to our presenter at the end. We'd also like to ask you to fill out a brief survey that will pop up as you exit the webinar. Your feedback is extremely important to us. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Lance Walker is the Global Director of Performance at Michael Johnson Performance. Lance is a certified strength and conditioning specialist and a registered physical therapist in the state of Texas. He previously served as Director of Performance Training at Integrated Athletic Development, where he was responsible for the training and/or physical rehabilitation needs of over 50 active professional athletes. A 1993 graduate of Kansas State University with a bachelor's degree in kinesiology, he also holds a bachelor's degree in physical therapy from the University of Oklahoma and a master's degree in exercise physiology from the University of Oklahoma. A well-recognized authority in this field, Lance has contributed to over 10 professional publications in sports science and presented at over 15 national conferences. And with that, I'll let Lance begin the presentation.
Thank you, Kyle. Guys, welcome. I know I can't hear you, but I'm anxious to get some of your questions at the end of the webinar, but it's always humbling to get a chance to talk about stuff that we actually use in the space, and I've done several of these now, and it's always cool at the end so to have your questions. So please, as we go along, have your questions ready and fire those off. We'll try to kind of speed through the front part of this to give room for some Q&A, but thanks for the opportunity. And again, I think the key thing for me, guys, is this is genuine. I'm using this stuff day to day in my practice. Our coaches and specialists are using it, so it's great to kind of share what we're doing in the space. This guy right here speaks to me. He was a guy that I was around at the Dallas Cowboys just briefly before I left. His name is Michael Irvin. A lot of you guys probably recognize him. And he was a conditioning fiend. I mean, this guy metabolically was unbelievable. And he said a cool statement once. He said, you know what, I may be 4.5 seconds in the 40-yard dash, but I'm going to be 4.5 seconds on the first play, the second play, the last play, and if we go to overtime. I'm going to be 4.5 in the 40 every single time. And that speaks to speed endurance, metabolism, grit, but it speaks a lot to some of these concepts that we're going to work through today in this webinar around the ability to train the energy systems for competition. This is my reference slide, guys, and I'm happy to provide the references that I use for things, but I think the big references that I'm kind of gravitating towards now are the practical references. This is 20-plus years for me. We have 150-plus years of experience dealing with these athletes, this population here. In our wheelhouse with the 10 specialists we have, 230, about 225,000 training sessions just under my belt. We're doing about 25,000 sessions a year just in this facility here in Texas, and it's a 50-50 split between the youth athletes and the high-end elite and professional athletes. So it's not just professional elite; it's elite youth, and it's in some cases it's just youth athletes that want to get off the bench. So that's my reference slide. Notwithstanding, I'll show you a couple of studies here in a little bit as well. I throw this slide up a lot to make sure everybody understands that it's equal parts arts and science. Right now, there's a lot of folks that I'm around that are very science-driven, and I love those guys and gals. I like hanging out with them and listening to what they have to say, but they sometimes don't, or they disregard some of the practical know-how. And the practical guys, the artistic people, the artisans, they sometimes don't pay enough attention to the science. And so for me, it's a split right down the middle between the art and science. So I'll try to provide you some artistic nuances to what we do, and at the same time try to maybe show you some of the places where the literature and the scientific relevance is either showing us the way or telling us we went in the wrong direction. Again, it's all about, for us, it's about being on the bleeding edge, but it's also about being very, very effective and efficient. And so if we're going to spend an hour with an athlete, we should be evaluated on the value we give for the hour, not just the fact that we put them through a good workout. So we're trying to gravitate towards this D target over here to really to make things not only relevant but effective and efficient is going to be key, and that's a big piece of why we use HydroWorks. We don't have it all figured out here in the States, guys. I don't know how many international folks we have on the webinar right now, but sometimes we beat the drum that USA's got everything figured out. And if you just look at medals per capita in the Olympic Games, we're not even in the top 10. We're just barely in the top 50. So to think that we've got everything figured out just because we have a bigger population than everybody is a problem for us. And so in some cases here in the United States, we've got to kind of go back and think, how can we make our athletes better? How can we do more with the 313 million that we've got to work with versus the guys in Jamaica up there, number 2, with only a 2 million population. They got 12 medals. So per capita, they are really beating our buck on a lot of these things. So it kind of is a humbling moment for me, I think, as I travel the world with Michael, to know that USA, I love it. I'm a patriot all the way. But you know what? We don't have everything figured out, and we can learn a lot from some of these other countries in some ways. That's our facility here in McKinney. I'll be showing you some pictures of that later. This is a facility in Geneva, Ohio at Spire. You see the pool system there. There's also our systems that we have running in the UK at St. George's Park. That's the Center of Excellence for the Football Association. They have an entire HydroWorks suite there. You can see bits of it there in that middle picture. So we're using this stuff across the globe, not just here in Texas. Puerto Rico, we've got a practitioner in Puerto Rico right now that they're also looking into HydroWorks systems. But as we expand across the globe, this is what it kind of looks like. So what I'm speaking, the reason the slides here is to, yeah, one, show you how we're expanding, but number 2 is it's not just here in Texas. This is global stuff that we're talking about. We're able to leverage some of the learnings from these global partners and locations to bring to bear to things like this. Teams we're using all these teams as well to clearinghouse what is best practices. A lot of these teams that we work with also have HydroWorks systems. So they're not only using the HydroWorks when they're here, we're able to converse with these individuals off-site and talk about ways that they're using HydroWorks. So it's all one big network for us in terms of really clearinghouse what is best practice in metabolic training and other training using HydroWorks. Olympic Federation's the same sort of thing. Guys, I'm going to ask you on the webinar to make sure that you think innovatively today. I'm going to give you a lot of background that you're going to be able to take a lot of this information and create your own pathways for success when it comes to metabolic training using HydroWorks. So I don't want you to feel like you're being gypped if I don't give you a ton of recipes that you just follow. You guys are artisans and artists and scientists yourself. We need more innovation in this space. And so we really want to make sure that we use our rules of thumb. We also use the science and the practice as sort of the base work for us to really innovate in this space, because there's so much right now that we don't know about what's going on with HydroWorks training for metabolic conditioning. There's more that we don't know than what we do know. So I'm going to ask you guys to think innovatively and use some of this information to innovate down the road, and then certainly share with me and others in this network on ways that we can improve use of this modality for our athletes. But ultimately, guys, if it isn't broken, you need to break it. And I think in this case, we need to break some rules to really move into the bleeding edge in this space. And I'll show you some rules that we're already breaking here at MJP, and it seems to be working out pretty well. Okay, innovation. We're forced into innovation. One of our partners is Nike, and we actually have an innovation lab right here. I'm looking at it across out my window here at MJP, Texas. So I'm kind of forced to think innovatively, and these guys are wicked smart and wicked creative, and it's really forced my hand to make sure that I'm constantly in an innovative space, using the practice, using the science together to come up with something new, including this 40-yard dash shoe. We talked about that in the last webinar. That was created bespoke for Marquise Goodwin's 40-yard dash to try to break the 4.2 barrier in the 40. So this sort of innovative thinking is something I want to make sure that we all kind of gravitate towards as we think about using a great modality like the HydroWorks system. A shoe that we created is another example. The Lunar Trainer 1 that you see on the shelves now comes from these learnings of innovative thinking applied to pre-existing sort of mantras. We're all about the athletes here at MJP. The different athletes that we have here, we cross the entire spectrum of the young youth athlete, as young as age 8 and 9, all the way up to the professional elites. The oldest pro athlete that I have right now is 52 years old. It kind of spans the 9 to 52-year-old range right now. But any athlete, any sport, any ability level is kind of our ethos around here, and it's around these characteristics of athleticism that we can change. So any athlete, any sport, these buckets are all changeable, modifiable characteristics that could limit or predict the athleticism for sport. And so we know we can change these things. We know we can measure these things. Obviously, we're going to be focusing a lot of our attention in today's webinar around that stamina bucket there in the bottom. And if you look at athletic performance as sort of a gear, you can see how all these things are driving that gear. And it depending upon the sport, different variations or different amounts of these different gears are driving the different sports, be it a golfer versus a tennis player versus a professional bull rider. However, at all times, all 6 of these gears are in play. It's kind of our system of training, and you can see how that limiting but modifiable characteristic can be then expanded. And this is the MJP system of expansion. So we expand on all those 6 components. The specific stamina bucket is where we're going to focus a lot of our attention today. And we expand that into 3 big buckets or 3 big subcomponents within the bucket to help us all kind of understand and encapsulate what we're talking about when we talk about stamina. And we'll use these 3 buckets or these 3 subcomponents in that bucket today as our currency of communication. And what we're talking about there in the stamina bucket is the big 3, is the anaerobic lactic system, the anaerobic alactic system, and the aerobic system. And those are going to be the 3 things that we're going to attack with our training modalities and hopefully change for the betterment of our athlete populations. This is going to take you back. Hopefully everybody on the webinar had some sort of exercise physiology course at some point. I tended to take a whole lot more because I ended up with 3 different degrees, and all of them required me to have high levels of exercise phys. So I've pretty much been inundated by this stuff. It's not the coolest stuff in the world to learn and to remember, but I encourage all of you to go back and revisit some of those basics of exercise physiology and bioenergetics. A great resource for this is the old McCardle Catch and Catch exercise phys book. It's my exercise phys Bible. It's a tremendous resource for me, and it's had more editions since my early days, but it does a really good job of explaining how these energy pathways work, the relationships between them, and this slide shows sort of how these energy systems, supply and demand, meets the stamina bucket, and it depends on what you're doing and what intensity and for what duration you're doing it. But one of the key things to understand as we talk about this stamina bucket is that all 3 of these energy systems are in play at all times. And sometimes we get into the concept of, oh, we're going to go do some aerobic work, and now we're going to go do some lactic system work. You may be emphasizing those areas of subcomponents, but make sure you keep in mind that at any period of time, they're constantly all at some point being worked. And so that's the little pictorial down at the bottom. You can show when an athlete runs for up to 2 hours plus, how that transitions from the anaerobic system into the aerobic system across that timeline and across that different intensities. So just kind of a revisitation to some of the things that most of us are probably very well versed in. Here's the energy contributions for the aerobic and anaerobic energy systems to specific track running events. So the difference between the 100-meter event where it's highly anaerobic in contribution to the 3,000-meter where it's a little bit more of a shift to the aerobic contribution. Also of note is the difference between males and females. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later. Understanding that there are trends. Certainly the 100 is very comparable across males and females, and notice as you get into the longer distances how that shift kind of changes for the female versus the male. Other ways of expressing where these energy systems come from are a percentage of max anaerobic power. So the CP system or the creatine phosphate system being the primary energy system in that 90 to 100% of max aerobic power, all the way down as you drift through the CP to the lactic system, which is a lower relative intensity for longer durations, all the way down into the aerobic system where it's a much lower intensity for longer duration. Also start to pay attention to these work-to-rest ratios, and those are the minimum effective dosages in order to tweak those systems or to challenge them in order to be better. So this is, again, a revisitation of your exercise phys. And these biomotor triangles for sport can also help you identify, this is from Bompa's text, an old text that I use a lot to teach with, of how to sort of stratify your different sports on their energy system requirements. This biomotor triangle is really impressive to me because it speaks to the fact that all sports, and here's the different sports that you might work with, all sports have an endurance sort of piece to them. They all have a force component and they all have a speed component. It's just various amounts of those things. So you can see the difference between a marathon runner, where the marathoner is much more biased towards the energy or the endurance side of the spectrum. The football offensive and defensive lineman is going to be more skewed towards the force and speed side of that pyramid. but that does not mean that there is not an endurance aspect to their training or to their metabolic needs. Okay. There are sport-specific energy demands. Now, as you guys are in your practices, whether it's a rehab setting or a sports performance setting, you guys know this as much as anyone, that there's sport-specific energy demands at play. And we've got to know what those are. And the interesting thing when you do get into the literature and you begin to work with athletes in a practical setting is you realize there's a lot of difference and a lot of variation, not only between the sports, but between the positions. And then there's even variations between the competitive levels. This is an example of a study, and I don't have the reference in front of me, but of a men's 400-meter energy demands study, and it shows on the left there the elite competitive men's 400-meter runner, and this is actually from a competition. That's the different three energy systems at play for the competition in an elite men's 400-meter runner. 48% from the lactic system, 14% from the alactic system, and 34% from the aerobic system. Now, on the right is a graphic of men's 400-meter sub-elite in competition. And if you look in the same study, just because they were sub-elite versus elite, the energy demands were different, slightly different. You can see they were a little bit more aerobic and a little bit less lactic in this particular study. And what you're going to find as you go through the literature is there's a lot of variation, not only between elites and sub-elites, males and females, but also between competitive 400-meter versus training 400-meter, or competitive soccer versus practice event soccer. So really there's a ton of things for us to learn in terms of creating what is the best metabolic training programming for our athletes with or without aquatics. You've really got to get in and dig around on this stuff. We also talk about age specificity when we do our metabolic training, and we're familiar with these windows of adaptation to training, and this is from a long-term athletic development slide here on the right. But basically what you see there is as you're moving from age 5 up to your 20s, there are these key windows of opportunity to train the stamina system. And for the girls, it happens a little bit younger than the boys, and there's even some specificity to what parts of that stamina system you train. But know this, there's actually these windows of opportunity that you'll actually get bigger bang for your buck if you put more of your effort and stimulus into those areas at younger ages. And I'm convinced now more than ever, having worked now for 20 years and in the field, that we're not doing enough with our youth athletes in the stamina bucket. We're all getting very sports specific and in a very early age, and one of the things that's falling off the wayside, I think, is the concept of developing athletic stamina at a young age. Here's a chart that we use for age specificity that speaks to that, those subcomponents within the stamina bucket. And you can see if you drop down here, I'll use my point here to show you, 8, 9, and 10-year-olds, if you drop into the stamina bucket, you can see where aerobic capacity is there's a critical window there and a critical opportunity to really grow that system. The physiology and the neurobiology for that system is really, really open and engaged in the growth process during that period of time. That means we need to dump the stimulus in there. Does that mean we wouldn't do anaerobic training with a 9-year-old? Not necessarily. However, if I've only got an hour and a half to train with them twice a week, I'm going to hedge my bet that when it comes to the stamina bucket, the metabolic training bucket, I'm going to hedge my bet into the aerobic side for that younger age athlete. As they get older, the 15, 16, 17s for girls and boys, you can begin to see some differences there as well. So again, just drawing from what we all know, and we've all got access to the same information now, let's use this information to begin to be very innovative in our thinking for metabolic training. There's traditional guidelines. These come from your Essentials of Strength Conditioning back in '94. To kind of begin to think about if you're using interval training as an example to stimulate some of these energy systems, and we all understand the differences between the phosphate system, the glycolytic system, and the oxidative system. And these are some of these prescriptives that we've used in the past to construct interval training to challenge the metabolic system. And what you'll see in my slides to follow is we do a lot of interval work using the pools to tax these systems. And a lot of these old guidelines still hold true. They hold their shape. When you get into the pool setting. I'll offer you up some nuances to this in a minute. But generally speaking, you can use your applied physiology backgrounds to really begin to prescribe metabolic training in the pool. This is the MJP metabolic fit principle that we happen to apply, and these are 3 big buckets: the lactic, and aerobic systems. the intensities, you can see for the alactic system are 100% intensity. You'll see the RPEs that we use, or the rating of perceived exertions, greater than 9 on that adjusted RPE scale. Those intensities have to be maintained for between 5 and 30 seconds at a time. 1 to 1.5, 1-3 rest intervals is kind of what we've been working around. 1 to 3 obviously is going to tax it a little bit more than the 1 to 5. And the kind of the minimum effective dosage of these things we found, and these are metabolic fit principles on land, as 6 to 12 sets of this sort of work. So that's kind of the minimum effective dose for the alactic system. And we can again look at the different percentages, 85% for the lactic in terms of intensity, 70 to 85% of the intensity on the aerobic. The time intervals expanded from 30 seconds up to 2 minutes on the lactic, 2 to 4 minutes on the aerobic. And then the rest intervals begin to shrink down from 1 to 3, 1 to 2 on the lactic system stimulus, down to 1 to less than 1 or 1.5 or 1 to a half rest interval on the aerobic work, 3 to 6 sets and 2 to 4 sets. What you won't see on my slides is long, slow distance applications other than the use in our flushing work. So we've kind of got away from the long, slow distance runs as a metabolic conditioner, and we begin to use those more as a flush or a recovery sort of stimulus. A word quickly about testing. The question is going to come up. Well, how do you know how intense things are? You can use testing. We don't typically use a lot of testing when it comes to the pool. We do use things such as percentage of heart rate max. The Carbonin method seems to be the best method to use to sort of estimate or guesstimate where they might be. As an example, this is the lactate threshold example. You could use the Carbonin method, which is the 220 minus your age, find the heart rate reserve, multiply that in times your percentage. So for the lactate threshold training that you might do would be 85% of that. Add your heart rate reserve back in, and you've got a general idea. Is it reliable? There's some debate there. We typically use the RPE scale as a sidebar to work with that heart rate method, but you'll see some video in a minute of some heart rate usages. The thing to understand in the water, we do make some water adjustments. If you're in the water and you get a heart rate response, we're typically adding 10 beats per minute plus or minus 2 to offset the difference between the water, the return blood flow in the water versus on land. So if you get a heart rate that's response that's 170 in the water, chances are pretty decent, depending upon the athlete, that it's probably going to be plus 10 beats per minute if that was the same intensity on land. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind. In my population, it really is not as important as it might be, say, in a cardiac rehab setting, et cetera. Lactate testing, we're not doing those things here. You know, the athletes don't like it. We don't like blood getting in the water. It's can be kind of costly. And I'm not entirely sure there's a whole lot of research on it yet for what our applications are. So we don't use a bunch of lactate, actual blood lactate assays. We do use a field test. There's a 30-minute run that you can use in the pool that we've used on ground as well. And if you like to use this test, it works pretty well with your triathletes as well as your endurance athletes. But basically, it's a warm-up in the water for 10 minutes, a hard run for 30 minutes at the pace that you feel like you can maintain for 30 minutes and not 31 minutes. Record your heart rate every 1 minute from the last 10 minutes of time, and that average heart rate is approximately your heart rate at lactate threshold. So these are some field tests that you can use to estimate these things, to kind of give you an idea of what intensity to prescribe to your different athletes, which is going to be very, very important. You can also use the intensity prescription of the adjusted RPE scale. We found this to be pretty good for the motivated athletes. Some of your collegiate athletes that are trying to pretend that they're working hard, maybe not as good, but the motivated professional athletes that we train and the elite athletes we train here are pretty honest with you. They'll let you know where they're at as in terms of their rating of perceived exertion, with this kind of rating 8+ being more in that lactate zone, 8 or less being in that more aerobic zone, to kind of give you a break point there. Where does metabolics fit? Metabolics fits in our system of dynamics, power, movement, force, metabolics, and regeneration. And know that no matter what bucket sort of you're training in, even if it's in our system, you're getting some stamina training done. But we'll talk specifically about our metabolics and how that's utilized predominantly for our stamina training. As I said, it's periodized. There's some conjugation that we do. I'll share that in just a minute. Number one is it's adaptable. It's a system. It's not a method. So we have a bunch of different things that we can bring to bear for our athletes in this space. When do we do metabolic conditioning? You can do in the off season, as an example, would be a dedicated system where they would be 1 to 3 hours a day for 3 to 6 days a week, and you can see where it lives in our daily run of show on the left. On the right is more of an integrated model where it's integrated into the in-season, and so integrating it with the sport coach is critical, and you can see where there's some integration of our system within a 30 to 60 minute window, 2 to 3 days a week. And metabolic conditioning, certainly we can integrate that into practice where we can. And then the HydroWorks system is a great tool then to use then to integrate in terms of post-practice or possible double-day training on athletes that need it. Okay. There's different options for this metabolic training in the water. 1 session per day example in a low-volume, high-intensity movement day might look like this, where they do the dynamics, power, their movement stuff, they get in the weight room, hit their force stuff, and then they finish with a metabolic session. In that example, the HydroWorks is perfect because we want to keep the impact low or no impact in that example right there on a 1 session per day. Another example might be 1 session per day where there's low volume, high intensity on the weight room work. And in that case, there's less of the movement, the impact loading on the movement. The metabolics at that point could take any form. Again, you could use the HydroWorks if you wanted to, but at that point you've got a little bit less chance of overloading those guys in terms of their joint stresses. Using the pool metabolically in a split session is very, very good. We've had a lot of success with using that on a split session with a minimum 4-hour split between the AM and the PM workout session right after the movement. So we finish the movement and we could bring them into the pool and do these metabolic trainings in the pool, follow up with some regeneration, bring them back 4 hours later, re-warm them, hit their power work, their plyometric work, or their force work, and their regen. So that's worked very, very well for us, and that's a model that we use with our NFL Combine training as well. Another split session, if there's less time, this is where it really works well. If there's less time between the sessions, let's say you only have time, an hour and a half, 2 hours to go get something to eat and come back, that's where the HydroWorks system really works well. Right after movement, we don't want to necessarily take them to a position where we've impacted them so much that it influences negatively the afternoon session or the 2 hour later session in the weight room in terms of plyos. The HydroWorks setting, you can get them in there, take the impact loading down, and still keep the intensity high, and you don't blow them up for the next workout. There's different sequential and parallel systems to using metabolics. We all know the sequential system or the long-term periodized things that you're all used to, but also the concept of maybe using this in parallel, and that's what we use. We tend to use a parallel system where our metabolic training is actually taking place in sequence with our force training, our movement training, and our power training. So our philosophy tends to be a little bit more parallel than sequential, although we have had some success with some of our partners working sequentially as well. We all understand the performance fitness fatigue model, and make sure you understand that there are these fatigue things that we have to deal with, and that's the key thing with HydroWorks, and I think in dealing with Aquatics is we may have to rewrite some of this fatigue modeling because I'm not sure we're getting the same fatigue from training in HydroWorks that we would on land. So this types of fatigue, muscle fatigue, central nervous system fatigue, endocrine fatigue, joint fatigue, that's what we're fighting with when it comes to conditioning. So if you're out there and you're conditioning somebody in a completely loaded scenario, say on a track or on the turf, and they're running or they're doing agility work or whatever, you're getting all 4 of these types of fatigue, and they can all interact with each other. But the thing is now with HydroWorks, doing this same sort of conditioning in HydroWorks, we may need to rewrite where some of this fatigue is happening and how much of it's happening, and how much of that fatigue, if it's getting minimized, does that rewrite when we can come back and hit those athletes with another session? So the old, well, you need to wait this many hours before the next conditioning session. We may need to start to rewrite some of those scripts based on the fact that we're reducing some of this muscle fatigue, some of this endocrine fatigue, and certainly some of this joint fatigue that can all relate back to increasing central nervous system fatigue, which is probably the big one that we've got to worry about when it comes to overtraining stimulus. And that's what we look at here is timing of when these things happen. So when are we going to put them in the pool? Well, let's base it on what we would do on land, and if you look on land, if you're doing extensive endurance work, you can put them back in some more extensive endurance metabolic training within 8 to 12 hours, and that's going to optimize where that supercompensation happens all the way out. So you can see the more lactic power work, it's going to take longer, 40 to 60 hours to supercompensate. Training them somewhere down in this range down in here, you might run the risk of overtraining. And so the key thing to understand about this, though we all know this, is how does now running in the pool influence this? Are these peaks, is this still quantifiable, 8 to 12 hours, 20 to 30 hours, if you do these types of conditioning efforts in the pool? And my recommendation is to begin to think about these things being shifted to the left. Every one of these things, when we condition the pool, the supercompensation is actually being pushed farther and farther to the left side of this continuum. And that's exciting because now it can add density to our training where we can get more stimulus, same response, and less negative sort of the fatigue things that we're worried about. The metabolic costs of water versus land when it comes to conditioning. There's a lot of science out there. A lot of it's old. There's some new stuff coming out now. I'll give you the Bluff report. The bottom line up front is the oxygen and metabolic costs are higher in water. The colder temperatures you used in your pool, anything less than 80 degrees, and or the less trained your athlete, the more there's going to be heart rate variability between the water stuff you do and the land stuff you do. And like I said, we use the 10 beats per minute rule of thumb. We keep our tub a little bit warmer, but not so much so that we get a spike in blood in sort of the metabolic cost. But certainly the colder, the less trained they are, the more variability that you're going to see in heart rate responses. And usually it's about half speed in water is equal to the speed on the land. We've kind of seen that rule hold true as well. The minimum frequencies and doses required. We know that stamina is 3 to 5 times a week. We know that the anaerobic lactic system takes 1 to 2 times per week. So that's where we're dosing these things. We also know that I can expect improvements in these different systems along different time frames. So when we have an athlete come in and say, I need to get in shape, I need to get my aerobic system in shape, and I've only got 2 weeks, I'm not going to lie to him and tell him I can get you better in 2 weeks of training. It's going to take 4 weeks of stimulus before you get a response in the aerobic power system. Lactic systems are a little bit quicker to turn around, and the anaerobic alactic system being the quickest to when you can expect to see improvements using the stamina training, and then specifically within the realm of the water. Days before the capacities begin to drop, this is important if you're trying to keep people's shape. You're trying to keep them in shape during a long season or during periods of inactivity. If you don't dose it, it won't stick around very long. You can see where some things like maximum strength, yeah, you can go for 30 days and not stimulate that, and it will stick around. Speed endurance, 15 days, and it starts to go south. Anaerobic stamina, 18 days. Aerobic stamina, 30 days. So if you don't stimulate these things within that period of time, you're not going to maintain the metabolics that you have. The energy system requirements of your sport may suffer if you're, again, using the HydroWorks to kind of stimulate some of these things during these periods of time can be very, very effective. And this is just, again, the hangover effects that we talk about of endurance training and speed endurance training and how that can affect other parts of your training menu. So if you look up at speed endurance on land, if I'm doing speed endurance, alactic, and lactic training, the effect of that stimulus can affect skill, speed, strength, power, and any of these other menu items up to 24 hours after the effect. Now, does this mean it's the same with water? And I'm here to tell you it doesn't. I think we're shifting these trends so we're getting less of the hangover effect, and we're able to come back and hit some of these other elements of the athletic development menu earlier because we're using some of the speed endurance of the lactic system training in the pool versus on the ground. And that, again, that speaks to that early to ripe, early to rot that we've all talked about. It encapsulates the two things. Okay? And the hangover effect as well of endurance, long lactic conditioning, and recovery work. So now we'll get into the practical for the last about 10, 15 minutes here that we have to talk about what we're doing. And this is an actual script. So what I'm going to share with you is the actual stuff that we're doing. You guys are probably doing a lot of cool stuff there. I'm the kind of guy that is kind of inclusive. Hey, there's a bunch of ways to do it. This isn't the only way. This is the way that we've kind of had some success over the last 8 years using HydroWorks here. And I've used HydroWorks now for over 12 years. So it's just kind of my meta-analysis and best practices for us. Doesn't mean it's for you, but understand our population is the 9-year-old up to the 50-year-old elite, professional, collegiate, aspiring athlete population is what we're going to be talking about here specifically in the rest of these slides. So this is an actual script from one of our pool sessions. You can see the 3 different levels. There's a recovery level, a very low intensity, where we're going to do some contrast therapy in the HydroWorks plunge pools. And then they're going to take them through some active flexibility and some dynamic mobility in the pool. And that's going to be a very low intensity. We have a cardio flush routine that we'll work through as well. Includes the same thing, mobility, and then works on some of these stationary core sprints that kind of gets the blood flow going. And we'll show you that in a minute, as well as a high-intensity setting, and we'll show you 3 or 4 different examples of our high-intensity sessions that we're able to provide our athletes. So again, different tools for different reasons. The low-intensity stuff, more for the flush. The high-intensity stuff, we're trying to stimulate change in those lactic system and alactic system variables, as well as aerobic power. So number one is, and hopefully the video's clear for you guys, this is one of our athletes in the water doing our warm-up, and we warm up before our conditioning. So that's a scripted warm-up for this athlete. It includes active flexibility, includes dynamic mobility. She's actually in the water right there doing some of the high knee action that's hard to kind of see. We don't have the video of the actual TV feedback. But she's actually going through our land-based dynamic routine. We're also going to have some, you're going to see some video where we're using the Aqua Logics tools, and I think Aqua Logics is a great little tool that we've been able to implement inside the HydroWorks setting to provide another different stimulus. And so you can see the underwater bells that this athlete's using right there, and that's a sampling there of the stationary core sprints where she's going to be working for sprints of a given amount of time for a given amount of intensity, and we'll go through the prescriptions of that in just a minute. We also use the video. Understand that the ABC, the always be coaching mentality, is an intensifier. And so we're asking her to do, when she does things, to do it with great technique and know that that intensifies the session. So we're bringing that coaching realm into the conditioning realm versus just sticking them on a bike and saying, here, go get some aerobic work, get your cardio in. We don't do that. And so we've had a lot more success when we apply the same sort of coaching mentality to the conditioning as we do our actual on-floor coaching. So here's some examples. So here's a cool example. Here's some actual practical things that we're using, some of the recipes that to attack these different energy systems. This first one, we call it the 30-20-10. It's basically an aerobic fartlek. And so it's going to help with some of that aerobic power, aerobic system development. The basic flow of things, you can see there's three sort of builds here. It's basically a walk for 30 seconds on the treadmill, a jog for 20 seconds on the treadmill, and then a run for 10 seconds. Then a rest for 15 to 30 seconds, get down to where you can talk to somebody again, and then you repeat the process. That's level one of the 30-20-10, and we'll try to work through that for five reps per set. And the idea is to get to a goal level of 3 sets of 5 of this rotation before you move on to the next one. And so we'll start, folks, in this very basic walk, jog, run with the rest interval. Level 2, then, after we're able to get to 3 sets of these 5 sets, and each one of those being a minute long, so it becomes about 5 minutes per set, so it's a 15-minute sort of an inclusion. They'll move on to the jog, run, sprint versus the jet, and then the rest for 15 seconds. Level 2, getting them up to 3 sets of 5 before we actually get to, this is the actual 30-20-10 workout. It's a jog for 30 seconds, a run for 20 seconds, and then a sprint versus the jets for 10 seconds continuously for those 3 sets. For those 3 sets of 5 sets, 2 minutes rest in between the sets. We've also added then the Aqua Logics to the tail end of this, where the athletes you can work 2 at a time, which is the video will show. You jog, run, sprint. This athlete's jog, running, and sprinting, while the other athlete is doing the 30-20-10 using the resistance exercise Aqua Logics. And here's an example of that, of 2 athletes going. I'll start these videos so you can see them. This is 2 athletes. One athlete's in the front doing the 30-second jog. This athlete behind is doing 30 seconds of a jog interval with the Aqua Logics. And we script the Aqua Logics. This happens to just be a fly, a pec fly and a reverse pec fly. Now you can see the intensification here. We're in the 20-second period. And then at the very end, you'll see a 10-second burst where now this guy is trying to run as hard as he can. He's got the jets turned on. This athlete back here is basically producing a froth in the water. So it's a 30-20-10. And after the 30-20-10, the athletes will then rotate. So athlete B back here will give the bells to athlete A. He'll jump on for his 30-second bout of jogging, and then the running, and then the sprinting. The nice thing about this setup is with the HydroWorks, you can get the jog speed set up, amp it up for the run speed, and then for the sprint, all you have to do is hit the jets. And basically, they are digging like there's no tomorrow for 10 seconds, and then they're rotating through. Great little stimulus for the aerobic power system. We like it a lot. And it's a blended development as well. An easy progression for this, there's volume progression, so you can take it from sets, from 3 sets to 4 sets to 5 sets over the course of a 3-week build. You can take it on a rest interval progression. In other words, if you want to make the rest interval 30 seconds, take it down to that 10 seconds in between those sets, or speed progression if you want to monitor the speed. The thing to incorporate with this slide that's important for everybody to understand, and I know this is probably review, you don't tweak multiple variables at the same time. You pick your spot. You're going to progress them volume-wise, then this is your lift. You keep the rest interval and the speed the same. If you decide that rest interval is going to be my progression, great. Keep the volume and the speed the same. What you do not want to do, or what we don't do typically here, is try to change 2 progressions at the same time. The other piece of this is to understand after week 3, we learned this from Coach Clyde Hart at Baylor, to give them a reload week. And basically what we'll do is we'll replicate the week 3 stimulus. We'll just cut the volume of the overall sets or the overall time or distance by about 30% and then recharge and pick up the progression where it left off. So that's a great rule of thumb on these reload weeks. Okay. Another great stimulus is the Hoff 4x4s. It's more for aerobic power. So now what we're doing is we're warming up the athlete in the pool for 5 minutes, getting their heart rate up to 70% of their max. And then we're incorporating a 4-minute run at greater than 80% of their heart rate max using that Carbonin method. So we've got the heart rate monitor on them. They're running strong at 4 minutes. We're recording the speed that they run that 4 minutes in. And then we're coming off and giving them a 4-minute active rest. So they could be doing some motion in the water. You could throw the Aqua Logics in there and have them just do some basic things, some basic stepping. And then we're repeating that. And the progression is very simple, right? So it's just 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off. That's hence the name 4x4. And we're building up these, again, in 2 different progressions. You can build it up by set. So starting off with 2 sets. Try this first. You'll see that you think, oh, 2 sets, that's nothing. Try it, and you'll see what happens. This aerobic power work can be very taxing. Or, and again, or being the critical thing here, you can build it over a longer period of time using this 4 sets of 2 minutes with a 4-minute rest interval. 4 sets of 2.5 minutes with a 4-minute rest. Notice the rest interval stays the same, but we're gradually working up to that week 6 doing the 4x4, which is the ultimate end game for us on these Hoffs, is to get to 4 sets of 4 minutes in the pool. Another progression, I've got a video of this one, is the 110 progressions. So the thing to understand for us as a practitioner is anything we can condition on land, we can modify and basically condition in the water. So a big conditioning progression that our athletes come in doing is they have a conditioning test they have to pass, and maybe it's a repeat 110-yard run, which is a popular one in football. So we're able to replicate the build for the 110 progression in the water to give kids that may be struggling a little bit with the progression on land some extra chances at metabolism training. They may be out there beating the pavement for you out there on the days that you're running with the team, but they continue to fall behind. A lot of cases we'll take this athlete back and add an extra day of lactic capacity, short lactic power work using this simple build weeks 1 through 11 and basically just replicating it by time instead of distance. So a 110 is basically 15 seconds. Week 1 they're going to do 7 sets of 2s of 15 seconds with a rest interval of 45 seconds, building up to these sets of 15 at 15 seconds with 40 seconds rest, 35 seconds, even down to 30 seconds rest. So the ultimate is building up to what is a test stimulus, 15 reps of 110s basically, or 15-second sprints with a 30-second rest interval in between. And so the build builds you that direction. And again, reload weeks every 4th week. The 300 progression is a better progression now to build to that 300-yard shuttle test that a lot of teams use for conditioning. And so this is a lactic capacity build. The end result is to get to where they can do 3 sets in the water at 60-second runs at 2 minutes. And again, these are high-intensity runs. These are greater than 90% of their heart rate max for 60 seconds. They're doing 3 sets. They're getting 2 minutes in between sets. That becomes the end goal for us, and we build everything backwards to get to that point. So this is a 12-week build, starting with 4 sets of 25 seconds with a 45-second rest interval. Again, high-intensity intervals. Now we're taking it, moving it towards this lactic capacity work, trying to expand that lactic capacity for longer and longer periods of time. Again, very, very taxing, but another way of adding an extra conditioning day on a guy or a girl that's having a hard time or has fallen behind in their conditioning, or is maybe perhaps coming off of an injury and needs to get back into condition. Another way to add another conditioning day without loading their joint system. And here's some examples in the pool of some athletes doing some of these things. I think what you see here is the athlete doing a 60-second run. This athlete here, you can see how they're digging. I mean, they're getting after. That's a 15-second sprint. The coach is right on top of them with the heart rate monitor. He's coaching. I wish the video and the audio would come together on this because that coach is coaching his butt off. I mean, that's something critical for us. We're not just going to say, oh, go get your cardio work. It's important that we spend the time and get the motivation for this athlete. Now the repeat. Here's number 2. He's coming back into the next set. So we're on top of the rest interval. We're on top of the intensity. We're monitoring and we're charting all the time. So if he's going to run 15 110s today, I want to know what speed it was, what the jets were, and what the heart rate response was, and I'm monitoring that week over week. So generally speaking, that's, again, the overriding theme there is, wow, Lance, it looks like you're just doing what you do on land in the water. And you're right. the key piece of that is we're able to add additional days within the microcycles perhaps. We're able to add an extra, maybe a double day training on some athletes because we're not getting the joint stress and the endocrine stress that we would get with the on-land training. So some more, maybe a little bit more nuances to this now too is actually taking the position-specific stuff that you need to condition for. And we all know that these different athletes, different sports, different positions all have different metabolic demands. And this is a cool one that we've started using now using HydroWorks is actually position-specific modeling. And this is a soccer example. So understanding the sport of soccer and an elite MLS guy that I'm going to train later today, these are the demands that he's going to have to face when he gets back into games. It's going to be about 70 to 80% anaerobic, 20 to 30% aerobic. He's going to get up to 10 millimoles of lactate he's going to have to deal with. And he's going to cover 7 miles. So I got to get him able to, to meet the demands of that. Now, to do that, there's land-based things, obviously, that we're going to incorporate as well. But in a lot of cases, what I can do is I can use the pool to add an extra day of position-specific modeling around these parameters. We know that the soccer athlete's going to spend less than 5 minutes sprinting. We know that his running is going to be over 20 minutes during the course of the game. Jogging is going to be spending 15 minutes roughly jogging. He's going to spend roughly 30-plus minutes walking in different angles and things, and he's going to actually just stand for roughly 12 to 15 minutes. So we can use these models to build in-water training. So this is a position-specific model for the soccer athlete, and we'll use these build-ups. We call them build-ups because it's a soccer term. This is the build-up to this play was this, and so the build-up for this would be a string of these movements. Jog for 60 seconds, walk for 20 seconds, sprint for 10 seconds, jump 3 times. A soccer athlete will jump 10 to 20 times in a match. Walk for 10 seconds, jog for 20 seconds. We'll string these things together, script it out, and build into what we call a 9-minute build. We'll rest a minute, and then we'll do another 9-minute build. And we'll string these things together to create halves of games. So you can see there's 5 9-minute builds to a half for this particular soccer athlete. We'll rest 10 minutes, and we'll repeat for the second half in terms if we were trying to model an entire game. Now, is it exactly the same metabolic cost as a soccer game? Absolutely no way. However, the athletes love this sort of thing because it really starts to bring the conditioning into more realism for them. We've had success with this with NFL football players as well, actually scripting plays, 12-play drives, 9-play drives, 6-play drives, a halftime, 2-minute offense based around what their movement patterns would be for their specific sport, for their specific position, and the specific distances run. And you can see how we would build this out over 7 weeks. In this case, we know in soccer we need to keep the heart rate above 70% of the heart rate max for the entire half of training. So again, this gives you guys the tools to really take what you're doing on land-based conditioning and apply it using some of those basic rule of thumbs and adjusters that I showed you from the literature on that Bluff report on making it relevant for them in the water. I see it as additional work. I see it as complementary work. And in some cases, I see it as sort of off-script work that we really don't know how many of these sort of sessions we could add into a microcycle to get benefit. And that's where the research, I think, can help us catch up a little bit. So with that, I know I moved really, really fast through that. Kyle, I apologize for being so fast. There's so much of this that we know, but there's so much more that we don't know. So I'm hoping you guys, I came across as not a know-it-all. I know you have access to all the same information I do. Let's be really creative and try to figure out how to use this modality for the betterment of our athlete populations going forward. And there's some rules that we're going to have to rewrite from the exercise physiology literature, I think, to move things along. So, guys, I thank you for your time. I want to open it up now for sort of any questions around some of that content we went over.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Lance. So at this point, like Lance said, we would like to begin the Q&A session. It looks like we do have several questions that have come in already, but I'd remind our audience that if you have any questions, you can just type those into the chat bar on the webinar dashboard there. Lance, the first question is, how do you use the available scientific literature or research in your practices using aquatic metabolic training?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's I'm a little bit of both. I understand that the practice, I use the practice of what we do, and this is for everything. This is for my physiotherapy practice. This is for my training of athletes in the weight room. I use the practical things that we know and that we've shared down the line over the years, and I've learned over the last 20-plus years. I use those practical nuggets as sort of the sort of the compass. Am I going the right direction? I use the science, and in a lot of cases, the good science is the science that's coming around behind the practice, really validating or adjusting or debunking things that we're doing in the practical world. I use the science as the torch to illuminate my steps. And so if you think about that, if you were trying to get from here to say Denton in the middle of the night, you'd like to have not only a compass to know you're going in the right direction, but also a lamp or a torch to identify where the rattlesnakes are. And you're not going to step on one of those in the middle of the night. So it's typically a balance of the two. What I do not do is I do not wait on the science to guide my practice. I let the practice sort of be the guide initially and come around behind with the science to make adjustments as necessary. It's a great question.
Okay, great. Okay, so our next question says, so on a progression for 30, 20, 10, do you alternate between the three, or which one do you advance? Do you have a recovery week?
Yeah. On the 30, 20, 10 stuff, for the most part, we're going to build a progression around one of these three. The typical progression we build around here that seems to work the best is a volume progression. Your rest interval progression for those that are really deconditioned, you'll need to give them more rest interval in between. So if you back up here, this particular slide that I was showing, this is kind of where we're going to start the very low conditioned athlete, giving them plenty of rest to get back to what we call the ability to talk to somebody before they pick back up. But this happens pretty fast. You'll see them recover and respond pretty fast to this, and you'll be able to move pretty quickly to this 3 sets of 5 sets, and they'll be able to tolerate it. You're constantly always evaluating the athlete to how well they're recovering, not only in the pool, but what they can do for you on land. This is the ultimate. This is kind of where we want to get folks to, and then progress from the 30, 20, 10 continuous and use this sort of volume progression at that point, so building them up. So that's the key sort of progression with the aerobic fartleks.
Perfect. Now, what type of build would you use for receivers or defensive backs in football?
Yeah, it's a great, it's really cool, guys. I mean, this position-specific modeling, you can do the same modeling for receivers. We've done that. We've studied game tape. And as an example, one of the things that we've used with on land for these metabolic modeling things is actually they're running routes. So they'll be out on the turf. We'll actually call out a route. They'll run the route, have to jog back to the huddle, call out the next route. And so they're actually running routes. Or blocking assignments on the turf. And what we're able to do is we'll pull that back one level. Obviously, they can't run routes on the HydroWorks, so we'll actually just pull it back in terms of distances and intensities and pull that back into the pool. So if they're running a 9 route, we'll set up the 9 routes, a typical distance of, could be between 25 and 40 yards. We're going to set that up as a distance run, and then they would jog back to the huddle. They'll stand in the huddle, we'll give them the next play, they'll jump on the treadmill, maybe it's a quick slant, that's a very short, intense thing. Maybe we'll blend in some jumps in between to stimulate that. So you can get kind of creative, but the players love it. They love that you're thinking about them in the arena that they're getting ready for. And this is more late stage things. You want to build the base first, obviously with some of the more basic work, but once you've got the base and we're starting to kind of peak up into that minus, T-minus 6 weeks before the season, 3 to 6 weeks, these position-specific modelings are fabulous to work in at least once, possibly twice a week with your athletes, maybe one on the ground and then one in the pool.
Okay, thanks. The next question is heart rate in the water more or less than what it would be on land doing the same activity?
Yeah, and that's, again, it depends on what literature you read. And I know researchers, there's probably some researchers on the call right now that'll throw pencils at me. We don't know. It's not uniform across the board. We do know, generally speaking here, that the oxygen metabolic costs are higher in the water. There's no doubt that the colder the temperature of the water, if we let our pool get below 80 degrees Fahrenheit, we see more variability in the heart rate. We try to keep right around that 80 degrees or thereabouts, but even then there's still some variability. So generally speaking, we use that 10 beats per minute difference between what you do in the water versus what you would experience on land at the same relative intensity. So if you're at an RPE of 9 in the pool and you're eliciting a heart rate of 175 beats per minute, you can just assume basically, generally speaking here at MJP, that if they were doing the same RPE on land, they would elicit 185 beats per minute heart rate.
Okay, thanks. Now, at what point in the process do you begin to use aquatics? How does it fit into the overall conditioning program?
So yeah, it's a good question. I think initially always the thought was, well, we'll just use it for those guys that can't condition with the other guys. So sometimes if it's a heavy athlete that's out of shape that's come into us that really can't tolerate the impact loading, we're going to go take the football team out and do their first week of 300-yard shuttle conditioning runs. And the first day is 5 doubles, which is down and back, or half gassers. And he's 375 pounds and is going to tear his knee up for tomorrow's weight room work. Again, that would be the initial sort of entree for him, is perhaps we actually mimic some of those things in the pool until we get his body weight down and get some of the strength values back up, or knock some of that deconditioning off. So you could use it day one. However, I think a key place for us also is for those athletes needing extra conditioning. And as an old strength coach, I used to send them over to the bike, and we're going to go do get some extra conditioning on the bike, or get some extra conditioning on the step mill. What I'm seeing this usage big and bad for us is these guys that do need extra conditioning, be it for body composition adjustment, or they're not on their marks in terms of progressing for their metabolic testing that's going to happen before the preseason starts. We're able to dose this in as additional. So they may come back. They may do their session in the morning and come back in the afternoon for a pool session. Alberto Salazar used this very, very effectively with his Oregon Project runners as a double-day workout to add extra mileage to his runners, so it could be used in addition to, in terms of both metabolic burn, but also in terms of total mileage. So yeah, everywhere, anywhere, early, late, recovery. Obviously, you can use this for your long, slow distance. It's obviously that we've talked about that a lot in different webinars, that the long, slow distance stuff in the pool is not as much for me used as a stimulus for aerobic benefit. I like the aerobic power fartleks better. I do like the long, slow distance, low intensity runs in the pool for the metabolic flush, and I like that better than any modality for metabolic flushing or cardio flushing that exists in the world, really. I mean, you get them in the pool, you get the compressive, you reduce the impact loading, the temperature's nice. There's a million reasons why that cardio flush, that low intensity, long, slow distance flush should happen in the pool. So, man, it's all over the board.
Okay, great. Now, do you have a specific position conditioning program for a ballerina?
Ballerina, I don't, but I think we have trained elite ballerinas, and I'm wondering if this elite ballerina is on this webinar. He might very well be. But it's what we would do in that case, if and when the conditioning was an issue, would be basically go back to that metabolic demands. I showed you the metabolic demands of soccer that we all know very, very well. We would have to do some learnings and understand the metabolic demands of that sport, of that activity, and draw up some of these models. What percentage anaerobic is aerobic? Is there even any literature out there? I'm not even familiar with it, but it usually starts with asking the people that know as much about that sport as possible, and that's certainly not me. So that's me talking to the athlete, to their coach, perhaps doing some literature review and digging up what are the metabolic demands for that athlete. In a lot of cases, it's going to be different males and females. The male ballerinas have different demands on them than the female ballerinas. So that would be a great study. I'd love to see somebody do it and model it up and start to use it, because again, I have a feeling this ballerina that we train is going to be back to MJP, Texas very soon.
Well, Lance, he did just confirm that he is here.
I knew it. I knew it. That sounds like a loaded question.
You caught him.
I caught him.
Looks like we have one more question here, unless others come in. You mentioned that at MJP you begin seeing athletes as young as 9. Is that the same age that you would say you feel it's appropriate to begin stamina training?
Yeah, and stamina training in general, and I'm glad somebody's asking about kids, because, man, I'll tell you what, guys, all the stuff we know and all these practitioners out there, everybody you talk to wants to, their career goal is to work with elite and professional athletes. And, man, I'm telling you what, guys, we got to turn that system upside down. Our kids need our best coaches, and they need our best science, and they need our best. We're ignoring our kids, man, and it's something I'm passionate about, and it's something I'm going to fight until I go to the grave on. We got to give our kids our best, and we're not doing it right now. So, speaking to that specifically for the younger age groups, here's that age specificity window. We love to get those young kids in to train this aerobic window earlier and earlier and earlier. And so this guy right here, age 8, 9, and 10, is a critical time to develop that aerobic capacity. And I'm telling you right now, we have so many 15, 16, 17-year-olds that are playing sport that don't have this capacity developed. Does that mean it's too late to develop it? Absolutely not. That's not to say these windows close. It's just to say that this is the opportune time. This is your cultivation time to cultivate the sort of the neurophysiology and the biophysiology around supporting that system. And we're not doing it right now. I don't mean everybody, but generally speaking, we're not doing enough of this. And so, gosh, yes, this aerobic capacity system, and then even the anaerobic system development in these ages 12 to age 16, really diving in and spending some extra time on those things, time spent there, taken away from some of the sport-specific stuff that we're throwing at these poor 12-year-olds, will be much better time spent and invested for the long term for these athletes. So what a great question. I'm glad you guys are focusing in on the kids because that's the frontier I think we've all got to begin to apply our expertise towards.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Lance. Thank you so much for taking the time for that presentation and to answer those questions. It does look like that's all the questions we have at the moment, but I would certainly encourage all of our audience members to indicate any further questions they have on the survey that will pop up as they leave the webinar today, and we'll make sure to pass those on to Lance. He's been nice enough to agree to answer any of those questions afterward.
Yep.
So I would like to thank our presenter, Lance, and all of our attendees for joining us today. As I mentioned before, you'll all receive a recording of today's webinar after the session. So thank you so much, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Kyle.